Hey guys, in this second part of the tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at adding in all the matte elements to finish the landscape. There's quite a bit here, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing I did was, there was just a little bit more painting I wanted to do. I wanted to add something to that middle platform. It was looking really bare. I just added in a couple little pieces of land to break it up. And now I'm starting with the matte elements. And matte elements are basically photo elements taken from stock photos to use in your painting. And as I've explained before, a lot of times this is used in video production to create backgrounds that wouldn't quite be financially reasonable otherwise, or would be too time-consuming to do. So by using a matte painting, you can add in these elements. And I started out with some clouds, and you saw me use a Curves Alpha mask, which I've gone over in a previous tutorial. I think extraction methods. And what you do is you basically go into your channels, find the channel with the best contrast, and then copy that channel and bring up your curves and create a high contrast mask. And then you see me when I bring it in here, I adjust the curves again using the channels to kind of color match it with the sky itself. Because matte painting is not just throwing photos on the canvas. If you've ever seen, say, a friend make a terrible Photoshop and it's obviously very fake, that's what that is, just slapping a photo in and not adjusting it at all. And here I'm just trying to set up the clouds. When I did paint the clouds, I didn't really think about them a lot because the cloud photos would be quite different, and that's one part of the painting that won't end up looking like the painting did, whereas the landscapes generally retain what they look like, the clouds don't as much. Again, just using the same technique to extract all these clouds, color correct them, and bring them into the painting. And here I'm just painting a little bit, color sampling off the other clouds that I've done. And matte painting is not just putting photos down. You are going to be painting either on top of the photos you add or adding to it. And here I'm adding a color gradient over top of my clouds and set to color and very low opacity. And I'm trying to find the right hue for them to match the sky and really make them fit in. And taking a palm tree, and a lot of these I already have pre-cut out from other times I've used them. If you ever looked at all my artwork, you'll probably see some of the same objects. Just because I don't feel like spending a lot of time looking for photos every time. And here I'm adjusting individual sections of the palm tree. Bringing up quick mask with Q and just brushing over some of the brighter hits on the palm tree to bring it in line with the lighting that's going to be over it, because there is going to be no direct lighting, so you don't really want any section that's going to look like it's brighter than the rest. It's all going to be fill and ambient lighting. And adding in some vines, and then just using a smudge brush, you can create kind of that growth look to foliage. And again, just adding in sections of the foreground piece from a photo, just grabbing different sections and adding it in, then cleaning up the edges, because you don't want any really dark edges sticking off the ends of it, because that's generally what's hidden underneath the plants. And here I'm coming in with a brush and filling in this section that I didn't quite have a photo for, so I decided to just paint it. And this is a brush I've used before in, I believe it was my first landscape walkthrough, where I take the chalky brush and you add scattering and rotation to it, And then you add color dynamics to it for the hue, saturation, the brightness, color variation. And then you just try to mimic the plants around it. You just keep sampling off, and adding dark spots to what you paint really helps sell that this is part of the same texture. And just following along and try to imagine how this is going to look. And a quick way to darken things is to add a color blending mode to it, where you sample off and add a dark color and then bring the opacity back. So if you went into your blending modes and it's color, and then just again adding in a photo element to help speed it along, because painting realistically to match plant textures is somewhat tedious and time consuming. So by adding in photo sections, you can speed that up. And I'm adding some vines in here because I felt that it was a little bit too open there in the top right. I wanted something to help break up the foreground more and set it apart. So say there's foliage right above the camera and it's hanging down into your view. And again, just adding that color blending mode to there, and then going back in with curves and adjusting it farther through a quick mask. And for most of these photos, they're taken from cgtextures.com, which is a stock site that's used for mainly video games, but a lot of other environments are great for matte painting as well. And again, just sampling off the bush there and painting over the side that I don't really have anything for. And I'm just trying to follow along and imagine how would this section continue. And then mixing it in with the photo elements can help trick the eye that this is all part of the photo. To create lighting is a simple trick where you basically paint with light. It's similar to how, say, a 3D program would render something, where you set the color overlay to, in your blending modes, to the color as I've done for the other objects, and then you create a duplicate of that layer, and then set it to screen, and mask it, and then taking a soft brush and you paint over the sections that will be hit by light, and you can adjust it farther with curves to make it fit better so it's not just washed out. And now I'm starting on the main landscape here, just painting in, trying to clean up the edge, and you'll see me quickly just grab sections of photo and again just creating little dark spots to help create depth in the foliage, because it was looking a little flat and I wanted it to match more with other things I've done in the painting. Again, going in with the curves, and you can see it's just very subtle adjustments on the curves, just gently bringing up, say, the red channel to pull the hue towards the lighting that I want. And you'll see a lot of times with these photos as I'm grabbing them, I try to grab sections that kind of fit with the way I want them to sit. So that first section you saw there was kind of facing towards the camera, and so I put it on the same side of the mountain that's facing the viewer. And I'm just grabbing in sections and kind of just stitching them together for now. And then what you do then is you paint over sections and connect them together so they fit. Again, I'm going in with curves and adjusting the color of each section so it matches the other sections. Now going with painting and painting rocks, and you paint rocks a lot of the same ways as you do the foliage, except instead of having it as scattered quite as much, you don't have it quite so high, and just having that rough, chalky brush really sells the illusion that it's rock. And way up close at 100%, it might not look totally believable, but when you pull back and look at the whole painting, you don't notice that there's brush strokes in there. It just all looks part of the photo. And that's really an important key in matte painting, is that you're not trying to paint every single detail. You want it to be kind of an illusion to the eye. Because a lot of times in, say, a video, how long is that single background really up for? A lot of times it's up for, say, a few seconds as the scene goes, and then it disappears. So you also have to remember when you're matte painting that the background is not always the star of what's going on. And now just quickly filling in. And a lot of it's going to be hidden by the elemental. So I'm just trying to quickly add in pieces, sampling off the main mountain and filling that in. And again, I'm just using the same brush over and over again. You'll find that a lot of the same technique gets used quite a bit in this painting. And there I go with the color blending mode and your blending options. And you can bring that up by right-clicking on a layer and going to blending options. And just setting a nice dark color, and then I'll duplicate that layer and just do the same technique I'll do for pretty much most of the painting, where it will be set to screen and then use a mask and paint on what I want highlighted. And I'm trying to adjust the hue of that piece of particular land to match the overall color scheme of the painting, which is kind of more of a warm yellowish red. And again, going in with curves to create more contrast with this particular mountain, because it's not going to be quite far enough away that there's going to be a lot of atmospheric perspective. And you saw me create a new layer in there, curves. Sometimes for bigger sections of pieces, you'll want to add a individual curves layer to that section, and then you have it mask inside of the previous layer. And that way you can add deeper shadows, so closer to the ground where it's going to be receiving less ambient light and bounce light. It's going to be darker than, say, the shadows towards the top of the mountain, where it's going to be picking up more light from the sky itself. And here I'm going in with the waterfall. And waterfalls are kind of tricky because most of the time I find that painting them really works for me. If this was going to be moving footage, you would probably have a video of what's going to go in there, and you could use that. But for this, I just painted in. And a lot of this little section I did decide to paint because it was easier than finding a bunch of photos to kind of create this little jungly section in the space between the mountains. And again, using that same color blending overlay. Adjusting the lighting towards the front because there's going to be some light hitting that. I'm coming in, it's sort of like a splashy brush, and just very loosely painting in some falls coming off the river there. And then with waterfalls, a lot of time there's darker sections, and that'll be because the rock is showing up through the back. You know, waterfalls are usually not just this big dropping thing of water. They do break up as they fall down. They don't fall in just, like, say, the water out of your sink. And just painting in some of that rock face there. Again, using the same brush. You'll find that most of the matte painting done in this particular painting is done by the same exact brush, which is very useful for creating rocks and foliage. And you saw me there create some mist uh, coming off the bottom of the waterfall because it will create a lot of mist coming up from that section, and it does help create kind of depth and kind of show the viewer that there is stuff down there. You know, you don't want to just think about what you can see on the painting itself. You also want to think about the painting as a whole. So what's down in that ravine, or what's past these mountains, or what's behind this? You know, how does it all fit together? And just painting this cliff face, adding some foliage to it. And I was trying to play around with how this section was going to go, because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And I thought that maybe I could just have some foliage kind of ringing around the edge of it, and with vines hanging down onto the cliff face. And you'll see me just painting them in. And I'm sampling off of that first bush that I did. And a lot of times when you are filling in with painting instead of using photo elements, you can just use that initial photo to get you started, and then you can really paint the rest of it. And as long as you mix it in properly and match the color and overall texture, it's very hard to tell apart. As long as you're not, say, have your face planted right against it, or zoomed in completely. And I thought about using a real texture on the cliff there, but I didn't quite like it, and I will get rid of that. And again, just sampling off and adding some little bright spots to the top of the plants there. And to create those bright spots, you increase the scattering and spacing on your brush. So it'll have some spacing. I usually have the spacing around 150% when I'm doing the main foliage, and then I'll really crank it up much higher when I'm doing the little highlights and dark spots. And here I thought about having some palm trees lining this section, and I did add quite a few of them in, but I ended up not really liking them, so I kind of pushed them into the corner, where they still stayed, but they're just kind of hidden there, and they just blend in. You know, they're just kind of this secret little palm tree in the corner. And I added some painting to that first piece, so it's kind of like there's these sections coming out from the middle of this mountain here. You know, it's kind of all coming down into this little precipice. And adding a little plant there for fun. You know, just sometimes adding in little things to break it up. And one problem I did have with this piece was the way I created this section was it looks like it blends with the foreground. And that's a lot of times where I talk about light versus dark, where it really comes into play. It's really important if you want to set things apart or push things farther back, because it does look like it's just kind of one piece and it doesn't look quite right. And I do fix that later in the painting. And just adding in a lot of palm trees. And I thought it would be kind of neat if the light kind of hit the tops of a few of them and came in. But it didn't sit well with me. And again, just using the same techniques over and over again, there is quite a bit of repetition. By using the blending modes and your blending options, going to color overlay, and then just lowering the opacity on that. And a lot of times you usually want to go with sort of a dark blue, because you'll notice that in shadows there is usually kind of this kind of very faint blue fill light. And I was just trying to find the right coloration for the palm trees, and I still wasn't happy. And here I am bringing in a nice central mountain area to add to the center of this platform. And you'll just see me quickly grab, using the lasso tool, a section of the photo, and then I'll clean it up once it's in the painting and adjust its color. And you notice that when I do grab these photos, I do kind of select them in the general shape of what I need. You don't always have this luxury, but it can help save you time. And that's also part of what matte painting is. It is there to save you time. I could sit there for 30 hours and paint all this foliage, but that would be a waste of my time. And it would end up rather tedious. I think by the end of the painting, you would probably just want to be done with it and not even care anymore. And when you are working in production, there is also that time essence. You are working under a budget constraint. So you do want to work in a manner that's quick, but still provides the look that you need and the quality that you need. And doing certain things is going to take longer than others. So doing a full city matte painting is obviously going to take you much longer than doing a jungle landscape. And I find in general that urban areas do take longer to paint because you have to be more careful with your brush strokes. You can't just kind of free flow. In human structures, there's all these straight lines and edges to them, and perspective is much more important, because in this landscape, yes, there is a horizon line, and when I'm looking over that, say that cliff face is below the horizon line, so I can see on top of that. But, overall, it's not as big a deal. I don't have to watch out for angles. As long as it looks fairly natural, you can probably get away with it. And that's another thing in painting. If it looks right, then, you don't have to worry about it too much. And here I'm adding in some rocky surfaces to the top to break up that grass. And just adding a couple dark edges helps create the illusion that some of these rocks are kind of poking up. Most of this section is painted because I couldn't quite find a photo element that I was really happy with that would create this section that I was wanting for, because this is an important section of the painting, because the figure is going to be standing on it, and that's kind of where the viewer's eye is drawn to. So I wanted to make sure that it felt right to me and wasn't quite too busy. I didn't want the foliage to take over what the main point of this section was. That's a lot why it's sparse and just has that rocky texture. And using the tilt feature of Photoshop, that's something I never had before because I always used CS3. So I'm still getting used to it being there. and I don't quite use it very often as I would like. But it is quite helpful being able to tilt the canvas, because it does let you create the same angle of painting with your tablet, so you don't have to kind of twist yourself around to kind of match the direction you want. And again, using my blending options, going and right-clicking and going to color overlay, and then duplicating that layer, setting it to screen, and adding a layer mask. And then you can instantly fill in the layer mask. Say if black is your foreground color, then you hit Alt Backspace, and if black is your background color, then you hit Control Backspace, and it'll just fill everything in. And that same thing goes for colors in general. Alt Backspace will use the foreground, and Control Backspace for the background color. And here I'm just adding some more mist to that bottom section because there isn't really anything important going on down there. You know, I just kind of want it to be like, okay, there's probably some trees down there, some greenery, and there's some mist from the water. So that's all that you really need to see there, because that's not the main focus of the painting. And that's something you can also get away with, is you can get away with leaving sections a little more unfinished, because the eye might not necessarily look for all those things. You know, again, it's viewing this painting as a whole. And unless you really step in and look at, you know, all the details closely, and then maybe you can see, okay, maybe this section is painted, or this section doesn't look quite as finished, but you usually don't notice that. Again, just grabbing sections, cutting them out with the lasso tool in the direction that I want, bring them in, and then color adjusting them using curves. And you'll see me go up to where it says RGB and bring up the channels, and placing a dot towards the center, and then gently bring it up will increase that color, and then dragging it down will desaturate that color. So you can create, say, orange by increasing the red channel and then reducing the blue channel, and that'll shift the color in the orange direction. You know, this is where understanding colors kind of comes into play. And if you ask me to explain color theory, I don't know if I could actually do it. It's just sort of kind of a memory that I've built up in my head by using it over and over again. You just kind of learn how things work, and when you're painting, you can just sort of go, oh, okay, if I do it like this, it'll produce this. And another type of curve you can do is an S-curve, when you're using curves, where you place a dot towards the shadows, and then you place another dot towards the highlights, and you create just a very faint S shape, and it'll increase contrast. Again, coming with that extra curves layer, using the previous layer as a clipping mask. And if for some reason it's not clipped into the previous layer, you can hold Alt and click between the layers, and it will clip that layer into that previous layer. And what that basically does is it makes it so the thing that's clipped only shows up on the previous layer. Again, if you see my photo extraction tutorial, I'm just very quickly creating an alpha curves mask by duplicating the channel with the highest contrast between the sky and the landscape, and then quickly cleaning it up. I'm adding in sections here, trying to match. And for this mountain, I really couldn't find a lot of photos of what I wanted. You know, I just fill in kind of a couple big sections here. But I didn't want to keep grabbing photos, pieces of that same photo and dragging them in, because eventually it's going to start to it might end up repeating in that look the way I want it to. Being able to actually paint does come in handy for creating a look that you want. And by mimicking the texture of the photo around it, you can pretty much fake the eye to believing that it's all real. Just grabbing in little sections and dragging them up. Here I'm taking my brush and just kind of painting in to connect the pieces, adding some of that rock texture to connect it together, and adding that little spot where it kind of rose up. I did like that section. It does help create variety in the landscape. And here I am, just very roughly adding in the basic colors. And if you are going to do a large section where it's going to be painted, you can just do that to quickly get it started. Just kind of get the base. Okay, this is how this is going to look. Adding in a little bit of a photo element to help the process along. And I'm cleaning up some of the edges. And now I'm going in with that same brush and just quickly sampling off other sections. Painting in. And here I am, I'm looking at other parts of this particular mountain I'm looking at. Like, how does this sit? How would this rock come down? And how would this connect together? So this is where sampling quickly really helps, and just, pressing Alt and sampling a point and grabbing all sorts of different colors. And then by using the color dynamics and the brush settings, it helps create natural variation in the colors that you pick, because there is going to be a lot of variation in real photos. It's not just going to be a straight green, or rocks do have a lot of variation in their faces. Even if you don't really recognize it at first, when it is all together, then it does really help set illusion that this is the texture that you want. Here I am again using the same duplication technique and screening it on, adjusting the contrast and curves to bring it down so it's not just washed out. And then adding that third layer in there and clipping it into the previous one with curves. And then by doing that, you can just paint in what you want to be darkest. It gives you a lot of control. And you'll see me using quite a bit of layers, but this gives me the most control over what I have. And when I do create these mountains, I usually bring them in piece by piece, and then I'll combine them together and then paint on top of that. I'm sure by now you've noticed that it is really a lot of the same techniques, especially in a landscape like this, because a jungle landscape isn't going to have a ton of variation in it. I mean, there's going to be different sections, of course, and areas up close, I have to treat differently, because you are going to see individual leaves, say, in the foreground. And that's something else you do have to watch out for, is your overall scale. As things get farther away from the camera, not only are you going to have atmospheric perspective, but the details that you could see quite up close are not going to be visible in the back. So that mountain I just did, you're not going to be able to see individual leaves sticking out, or, little tiny details. And that's something you want to watch out for, is in your photo elements, their scale. Certain photos you're not going to be able to use directly up close, and other photos you're not going to be able to use in the distance, at least not without quite a bit of painting to them. And you saw me quickly fill in that cliff face, just grabbing that nice vertical cliff texture from that stock photo. Again, just connecting these pieces together. And I did want to have a way to kind of separate these two mountains. So I am having kind of a flatter face facing towards the camera. That way when I do create the shadow, it kind of sets it apart from that first mountain there. And you can't always do that, but it can help kind of break apart your pieces that you're working on. You know, you won't always be able to separate. And again, I'm just sampling and painting in, you know, trying to connect those pieces together. And I'm looking at what is the elemental covering up. If I was doing, say, a full matte painting, I might want to fill in everything depending on how the camera would go. Or if I wanted to do kind of a cool thing you can do with these type of things is, say it wasn't going to be a full video, you could still, say if I wanted this in a demo reel, I could break the sections up and kind of pan the camera around a little bit, and it creates this neat effect where things do look like they're in the distance. And I wasn't really happy with how this mountain was looking. You know, parts of it looked kind of pixelated. It wasn't really matching the quality of the other photos I was using. So I came back in with the brush and I added, you know, I painted over quite a bit of the photo I wasn't happy with and adding more shadow sections to help create depth to that foliage, because this particular section was not quite as far away. And because the lighting is on a mask, if I duplicate that again, I can just copy the mask by holding Alt and dragging it onto the new duplication to quickly add that back. And just very briefly painting in that far mountain. I didn't really want to add any real texture to it. No, just painting in briefly, adding a small variation to it, because this mountain there would be pretty far in the distance and you would pick up very little detail. So if you've ever been driving and you look at things really far away, they just, you know, they almost appear like a silhouette against the sky. Especially if there's any kind of weather conditioning on, any kind of haze, you know, it really increases that. This section now is much farther away. So when I am adding that blending color overlay, it's going to be a bit brighter and bluer towards the sky. So as you get farther away, you're going to want to sample up the sky more. And when you're closer, you still will sample off the sky, but then you darken it almost all the way down. And I didn't really like how that mountain was sitting. It was a little bulky, and I'm just painting in over top of it to kind of set up how I want it to look. And very quickly cutting out some photo elements. And overlaying them on top. And just, again, when I cut them out, I'm following along that painting that I did. And this is where, when I mentioned that you kind of want your photos to conform to what you've done, where that comes in handy. Because I know what to look for, I know what to grab out of these photos, and I know how to connect them together to make it look how I want them to. And I didn't really like that particular piece. And photos might not always cooperate. You know, you might grab a section that you think will look great, and then you stick it in, and it's like, nope, this doesn't work at all. Either because part of it doesn't match at all, or it just... And adjusting that blending color overlay, I'm really leaving it much higher this time. And adding in some very faint highlights to the back side of that mountain that's facing towards the light source. And here I am filling in this middle section. I just grabbed another flat piece of land. It's not even a jungle, but you know, by painting over it a little bit and just kind of fitting it in there, you can't really tell it apart from the rest of the painting. You know, when trees get that far away, they kind of take the same texture, and that's a lot of how I use that brush, is that by using that brush it creates that leafy texture that a lot of plants seem to have. And I'm darkening this front area because it is closer to the camera. And by using a quick mask and a soft brush I can do that. And then just painting along the edge here. You know, trying to connect it to this cliff face. And just quickly sampling in off the photo and painting in the back there. You know, it is kind of hidden back there, and as it gets into the distance, I don't have to worry about as much detail. And, you know, this is coming to a close now, and you'll see just by using a lot of the same techniques and quite a bit of painting, you can really create this illusion that all these photos started here. It was this one complete landscape. And here I'm adding a curves adjustment, and this I've done to the whole photo to create a sort of a vignette effect, because the foreground is going to be darker. I want light streaming in, and for the light streaming in, I do create sort of this light source and bringing up the right curves and kind of directing it towards that the top of the cliff face there where the figure is standing. And that's going to do it for this part of the tutorial. In the final part, I'm going to be detailing the elemental and adding any finishing touches. So thank you for watching and stay tuned.